Get him out of my seat. I don't sit next to people like him. A billionaire humiliates a quiet man in first class, forcing him to stand in front of everyone. But when the flight attendant finally checks his name in the system, her face completely changes. Because the man they're mocking isn't just any passenger. And what she's about to say next will silence the entire cabin. The first-class cabin was still settling into itself when the moment began. Quietly, almost invisibly, like something that didn't yet know it was about to become unforgettable. Soft white light stretched across the ceiling in clean lines, reflecting gently off polished armrests and untouched leather seats. Outside the oval windows, the early morning sky held a pale silver glow, and ground crews moved with slow precision across the tarmac. Inside, everything felt controlled, measured, expensive, the kind of environment where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. Passengers arranged their belongings with quiet confidence. A businessman adjusted his cufflinks. A woman scrolled through her phone. A young traveler leaned back, already half lost in music. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisle, their voices soft, their smiles practiced, maintaining the illusion that everything here existed exactly as it should. Then, without announcement, Keanu Reeves stepped into the cabin. There was nothing dramatic about his entrance. No sudden attention, no turning heads. Just a man walking in with quiet patience, carrying a small bag, dressed simply, dark jacket, plain shirt, worn shoes. His hair slightly unkempt, his beard lightly grown. Nothing about him demanded recognition. And that was the point. He paused briefly near the entrance, glancing down at his boarding pass. A small nod to the flight attendant. No rush. No expectation. Then he moved down the aisle with the calm rhythm of someone who had never needed to prove his place in a room. Most people didn't notice him. A few glanced up, then looked away again. He reached the second row on the left and stopped. The window seat. His seat. But someone was already there. Or rather, someone was already owning the space beside it. In the aisle seat sat a man who looked like he belonged exactly where he was. Sharp navy suit. Polished shoes. Silk tie. A gold watch that caught the cabin light every time he moved his wrist. His leather briefcase rested carefully under the seat in front of him, positioned with precision. His phone in hand, his expression focused, controlled, important. This was Richard Halston, a man who didn't just sit in first class. He identified with it. Keanu stood beside the row, waiting. Patient. Quiet. Richard didn't look up at first. To him, the man standing there was just another background movement in a space that revolved around his own schedule. But after a moment, he raised his eyes. And everything changed. His gaze moved over Keanu slowly, too slowly. From the jacket, to the shoes, to the bag, to the face. And in that one silent evaluation, something settled in his expression. Judgment. Keanu offered a small, polite smile. "Excuse me," he said gently, reaching toward the overhead bin. Richard leaned back slightly, not enough to be openly rude, but enough to create distance. Enough to signal discomfort. Keanu placed his bag carefully above, making sure not to disturb anything already there. His movements were deliberate. Respectful. Controlled. Then he turned back toward the seat. Richard still hadn't moved his legs. The space remained blocked. Keanu paused again, his voice calm. "That's my seat," he said softly, indicating the window with his boarding pass. Richard looked at the pass, but didn't really read it. "Your seat," he repeated, his tone already edged with disbelief. "Yes," Keanu said. "The window." Richard let out a faint breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, but close enough to feel like one. Around them, the cabin continued moving. Bags lifted. Conversations murmured. But near row 2, something subtle had begun to tighten. "This is first class," Richard said slowly. Keanu met his gaze. "I know." The simplicity of that answer landed heavier than expected. Richard shifted slightly, pulling his legs back just enough to allow space, but not enough to welcome it. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I paid a very high price for this seat." Keanu nodded once. "I'm sure you did." No challenge. No sarcasm. Just calm. And somehow, that made it worse. Because Richard had expected something else. Embarrassment. Hesitation. Apology. Instead, he got composure. And composure, from someone he had already judged, felt like resistance. He leaned back further now, studying Keanu more openly. "You don't look like someone who belongs here," he said. The words were quiet. But clear. And they didn't stay between them. A woman behind them paused mid-motion. A passenger across the aisle lowered his headphones. Even the soft movement of the cabin seemed to slow, just slightly. Keanu didn't react immediately. But something in his eyes sharpened, not anger, not offense, just awareness. "Looks can be misleading," he said. Richard smiled faintly. "Or maybe standards are slipping." Silence spread. The kind of silence that doesn't stop sound, but changes how everything feels. Keanu glanced briefly down the aisle, then back. "I don't want to disturb anyone," he said quietly. "I just need to sit." That should have been the end of it. It could have been. But it wasn't. Because Richard wasn't finished. As Keanu carefully stepped past him and slid into the window seat, Richard shifted away slightly, pulling his arm in as if proximity itself was uncomfortable. Keanu noticed. He said nothing. For a moment, everything seemed to settle again. The tension loosened just enough to disappear into the background. But then, a soft ding echoed above them. Richard had pressed the call button. And just like that, the moment wasn't over. It was just beginning. The soft chime from the call button still lingered in the air when the nearest flight attendant turned toward row 2. Her name tag read Emily. She approached with the same composed smile she had given every passenger that morning, but there was already a subtle awareness in her eyes. The kind that comes from experience. The kind that senses tension before it fully reveals itself. "Good morning, sir," she said gently, stopping beside Richard's seat. "How can I help you?" Richard didn't look at her right away. Instead, he adjusted his cuff slowly, deliberately, as if the delay itself added weight to his words. "I need a different seat," he said. Emily's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Softer. More careful. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there something wrong with your seat?" "Yes," Richard replied, finally turning his head slightly toward Keanu without fully acknowledging him. "There is." Emily followed his gaze, just briefly, then returned her attention to Richard. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" Richard exhaled through his nose, leaning back into his seat as if explaining something obvious. "The issue," he said, "is who I'm sitting next to." The words didn't rise in volume, but they spread. Like something dropped into still water, sending ripples through the surrounding rows. Emily's posture remained professional, but her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir," she said carefully, "both seats are assigned. Is there a specific concern I can assist with?" Richard leaned slightly closer to her now, lowering his voice just enough to seem controlled, but still loud enough for others to hear. "I booked first class for a reason," he said. "I expect a certain standard." A few passengers nearby shifted subtly. No one interrupted. No one spoke. But the attention had fully gathered now. "I understand," Emily replied. "And we want to make sure you're comfortable." Richard nodded faintly, as if confirming his own point. Exactly. And I'm not comfortable sitting next to someone who clearly doesn't meet that standard. The sentence landed heavier than the first. There was no mistaking it now. No ambiguity. No room to reinterpret. Across the aisle, a young passenger slowly removed his headphones. Behind them, a woman paused with her bag halfway into the overhead bin. Keanu sat still beside the window. Hands resting lightly in his lap. Eyes lowered, not in shame, but in restraint. Emily glanced toward him for just a second, and in that moment, there was something human in her expression. Something apologetic. But her role held her in place. "Sir," she said to Richard, her voice firmer now, "I need you to lower your voice." "I am calm," Richard replied quickly. "I'm just asking for what I paid for." "You paid for your assigned seat," Emily said. "And I expect to sit next to someone appropriate for this cabin," he answered. The silence that followed felt tighter now. More focused. Keanu lifted his gaze slightly, looking at Richard for the first time since sitting down. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. Richard met his eyes with a faint, dismissive smile. "I know enough." That was the moment. The line that shifted everything from discomfort to something deeper. Emily inhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward Keanu. "Sir, may I please see your boarding pass?" Keanu handed it to her without hesitation. "Of course." She checked it quickly, seat number, row, class. Everything matched. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "Your seat is correct." Richard's expression tightened instantly. "Check again." Emily held her ground, but the pressure was building now, not just from Richard, but from the eyes around them, the stalled boarding behind them, the narrow aisle slowly filling with waiting passengers. "Sir," she said, "the boarding pass clearly shows." "Then check the system," Richard interrupted. "Check the manifest. I'm not sitting through an entire flight like this." The words were sharper now. Less controlled. More public. Keanu leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the window, but his attention was still present, still steady. There was no anger in him. Just a quiet heaviness. Emily hesitated. She knew the seat was valid. She knew the request was unreasonable. But she also knew the situation was escalating, and the aisle behind them was no longer moving. Passengers were waiting. Watching. Judging. And in moments like this, the pressure to resolve quickly often overrides the instinct to resolve fairly. "I'll call my senior attendant," she said. Richard nodded once, satisfied. "Yes. Please do." Emily stepped away, moving toward the front of the cabin with controlled urgency. For a brief moment, the space around row 2 was left without authority. And in that space, silence deepened. Richard leaned back, adjusting his watch again, reclaiming his posture. "This could have been avoided," he said under his breath. Keanu didn't turn. "Yes," he replied softly. Richard frowned slightly. He wasn't sure if that was agreement, or something else entirely. "People should know where they belong," Richard continued. This time, Keanu turned his head. "And who decides that?" he asked. Richard gave a small, confident smile. "Life does." Keanu held his gaze for a moment longer than before. Then he nodded, almost thoughtfully. "Life changes its mind often." The sentence didn't sound like a challenge. But it stayed in the air longer than anything else that had been said. Before Richard could respond, Emily returned. And she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a woman in her 40s, composed, steady, carrying a tablet. Her presence was different. Quieter, but stronger. Her name was Clara. And the moment she stepped into the row, The atmosphere shifted again. "Good morning," Clara said calmly. "I understand there's a seating concern." Richard straightened immediately. "Yes," he said. "There is." Clara looked at him directly. "Please explain." He gestured toward Keanu, this time more openly. "This man is assigned to the seat beside me," he said. "I find that very hard to believe." Clara's eyes moved briefly to Keanu, then back to Richard. "And why is that?" she asked. Richard exhaled, irritated by the question. "Because this is first class." Clara nodded once. "Yes, it is. And I expect first-class standards." Her expression didn't change. "All passengers in this cabin are expected to follow the same standards of conduct and respect." The sentence was calm. Measured. But unmistakable. Emily glanced down slightly, almost hiding a reaction. Richard, however, felt the shift, and didn't like it. "That's not what I meant," he said. "Then please clarify," Clara replied. There was a pause. A brief moment where Richard could have stepped back. Softened. Reframed his words. But pride doesn't retreat easily, especially when it has an audience. "Fine," he said. Then, clearly. "He looks cheap." The words landed harder than anything before them. No subtlety. No cover. Just truth, in its worst form. The cabin went still. Completely still. Even Clara paused this time. Not out of surprise. But because the situation had now crossed a line that couldn't be disguised as misunderstanding. Keanu remained seated. Silent. Present. And somehow, that silence carried more weight than everything Richard had said. Clara looked at Richard, her voice firmer now. "Sir, that is not acceptable." And just like that. The moment changed again. The silence that followed Clara's words didn't fade. It deepened. "Sir, that is not acceptable." Her voice had not been loud. It didn't need to be. There was a quiet authority in it now, one that didn't bend, didn't negotiate, didn't hide behind politeness anymore. Richard blinked, caught off guard. For the first time since the confrontation began, something in his expression shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that the ground beneath him was no longer steady. "I'm just being honest," he said, though the sharp edge in his voice had dulled slightly. Clara held his gaze. "Honesty without respect is not acceptable on this aircraft," she replied calmly. That sentence didn't just respond, it reframed everything. Around them, the watching passengers didn't move, didn't speak, but the energy had changed. The quiet support that often hides behind silence was now leaning, ever so slightly, away from Richard. He felt it. And it made him uncomfortable. Still, he pushed forward. "Then verify it," he said, gesturing toward Keanu. "Check the manifest. If he belongs here, prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a final attempt to regain control. Clara didn't react emotionally. She simply nodded once. "We will verify the seating," she said. "But I want to be clear, if the seat is assigned correctly, he has every right to remain there." Richard leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "We'll see." Clara turned toward Keanu. "Sir, thank you for your patience. May I confirm your boarding pass again?" Keanu met her eyes with quiet calm and handed it over without hesitation. "Yes, of course." There was no frustration in his voice. No demand. No attempt to defend himself. Just cooperation. And somehow, that made the situation feel even heavier. Clara took the pass and began checking the tablet in her hand. Emily stood beside her, close enough to see the screen, her posture attentive but tense. The aisle behind them had nearly come to a stop now. A few passengers had already taken seats just to avoid standing in the discomfort any longer. Others remained still, watching quietly. Richard's eyes stayed locked on the tablet. Waiting. Expecting. Needing the result to match his belief. Keanu, on the other hand, leaned back slightly into his seat. Still. Unmoving. Allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Clara scrolled through the manifest carefully. Row number. Seat number. Passenger name. Booking class. Everything checked. Then. Her. Then. Her finger stopped. Just for a second. It was small. Barely noticeable. But in a moment like this, even the smallest pause becomes visible. Emily noticed it immediately. Her eyes flickered toward Clara. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the screen again. Then again. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it sharpened. Focused. And then, shifted. Not confusion. Recognition. She lifted her eyes slowly, and looked at Keanu. This time, differently. More carefully. More knowingly. Then she looked back at the tablet. Emily leaned slightly closer, her eyes scanning the screen. And then she saw it too. The name. Clear. Unmistakable. Keanu Reeves. For a brief second, her professional composure slipped, not visibly enough to create a scene, but enough for someone observant to catch it. And Richard was observant. He noticed both of them. The pause. The glance. The shift. "What is it?" he asked, a hint of urgency creeping into his voice. Clara straightened slightly. Her posture more formal now. Her tone controlled. "The seat is confirmed," she said. Richard frowned immediately. "That's it?" Clara met his gaze. "Yes, sir. The passenger is seated correctly." Richard's jaw tightened. "You checked the name?" "I did." "And?" Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than before. Then she spoke, calm, precise. "Mr. Reeves is in the correct seat." The name didn't echo loudly. But it didn't need to. It traveled just far enough. To the row behind. Across the aisle. Into the awareness of those who had been watching from the beginning. And most importantly, to Richard. For a second, nothing happened. No reaction. No movement. Just stillness. As if the name had reached him before the meaning had. Then slowly. His eyes shifted. Toward Keanu. Who sat exactly as he had been since the beginning. Calm. Quiet. Unchanged. The same man Richard had judged. The same man he had called cheap. The same man he had tried to remove. But now. Everything looked different. The simple jacket no longer seemed out of place. The quiet presence no longer seemed weak. The silence no longer seemed empty. It felt intentional. Grounded. Complete. "Mr. Reeves." Richard repeated under his breath. Clara gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." The weight of realization settled in. Not all at once. But enough to crack the confidence he had been holding on to. Around them, the cabin reacted in subtle ways. A raised eyebrow. A glance exchanged. A quiet shift in posture. No one spoke. But everyone understood. Emily stood still beside Clara, her expression now composed again, but there was a quiet seriousness behind it. Because she understood something important. The problem had never been that Richard didn't know who Keanu was. The problem was that he believed someone deserved less respect until proven otherwise. And now that belief had nowhere left to hide. Richard swallowed. "I didn't realize," he said. The words came out quickly. Too quickly. As if saying them early might soften what had already happened. Keanu turned his head slightly toward him. His expression was calm. But distant. "Most people don't," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice. No sharpness. But there was truth. And truth, when delivered without emotion, often lands deeper. Clara stepped slightly back, regaining control of the space. "Sir," she said to Keanu, her tone respectful, "I apologize for the delay. You may remain in your seat." Keanu gave a small nod. "Thank you." Emily followed quickly. "Can I bring you something, sir? Water, coffee, anything at all?" Keanu looked at her gently. "Water would be nice. Thank you." She nodded and stepped away, relieved to do something helpful. Clara gave one final glance at both men, then turned back toward the aisle. "Let's continue boarding," she said calmly. And just like that, the authority moved on. But the moment didn't. It stayed. Right there. In row 2. Between 2 seats. Between 2 men. Richard sat back slowly, his posture no longer confident, just still. The air around him felt different now. He could feel the shift in perception. The quiet awareness of the passengers. The invisible weight of what had just happened. Keanu turned back toward the window. Looking out. As if none of it had changed him. And somehow, that made everything feel even heavier. Richard adjusted his watch. Then his cuff. Then his tie. Small movements. Restless. Searching for control. But control wasn't there anymore. Only silence. And in that silence, something began to change. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. And for the first time since the moment began, Richard didn't know what to say next. The cabin slowly began to breathe again. Not fully. Not naturally. But in the careful, cautious way people return to normal after witnessing something uncomfortable in public. Overhead bins continued to close. Bags were adjusted. Seatbelts clicked into place. Flight attendants resumed their quiet rhythm through the aisle. But nothing truly felt the same anymore. Row 2 remained the center of something that had already happened, but still hadn't settled. Richard sat stiffly in his seat, staring forward. Not at Keanu. Not at the crew. Just forward. Because looking anywhere else felt like acknowledging too much. Too directly. Too honestly. Beside him, Keanu remained still. Hands resting loosely in his lap. His gaze turned toward the window, where ground vehicles moved slowly beneath the aircraft wing. Calm. Routine. Unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside the cabin. He had not reacted with anger. Not with satisfaction. Not even with visible relief. Just quiet acceptance. As if the entire encounter belonged to someone else's story more than his own. That was what unsettled Richard most now. Not the recognition. Not the crew's reaction. But the fact that Keanu had not needed any of it to behave differently. A flight attendant passed by, offering final assistance to boarding passengers. Her tone was polite, controlled, practiced. But even she seemed slightly more careful when approaching their row, as if the air itself required gentleness now. Richard noticed it. Every small detail. Every glance that lasted half a second too long. Every silence that lingered just a little too deeply. It all felt heavier. He adjusted his tie again. Then stopped. Because it didn't help. Nothing physical seemed to help anymore. Across from them, a passenger pretended to read a screen but kept glancing. And awareness, Richard realized, was its own kind of judgment. He exhaled slowly. Then finally turned his head slightly. Toward Keanu. But didn't speak. Not yet. Keanu sensed the movement. Not by looking. But by presence. He turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. And waited. That waiting was different now. Before, it had felt like resistance. Now, it felt like space. Richard hesitated. The words he wanted to say didn't line up easily anymore. They weren't confident. They weren't rehearsed. They were fragile. He started. Then stopped. He looked away briefly. Collected himself. And tried again. I didn't know who you were, he said. Keanu didn't react immediately. He simply watched him. Not judging. Not accepting. Just listening. I mean, Richard continued, voice lower now, I've seen your films. I just didn't recognize you at first. The sentence sounded different now than it would have 10 minutes earlier. Less like explanation. More like defense. Keanu's gaze remained steady. That happens, he said quietly. Richard nodded quickly. Yes. Exactly. It happens. But even as he said it, he felt the weakness in it. Because the problem was no longer recognition. It was intention. He cleared his throat slightly. It was a misunderstanding, he said. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Was it? He asked. The question wasn't sharp. But it removed something. A shield. A comfort. A shortcut. Richard paused. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. Because something inside him was no longer trying to protect the moment. It was trying to understand it. He looked down at his hands. Then spoke more slowly. I handled it badly, he admitted. Keanu gave a small nod. Yes. No judgment. No softness. Just truth. And somehow, that made it harder. Richard exhaled. I shouldn't have said what I said, he continued. I shouldn't have assumed things about you. He paused again. Choosing words more carefully now. I judged you based on how you looked. Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was listening. Keanu finally spoke. People do that more often than they realize. Richard looked at him. Not defensively now. Just honestly. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I've done it more than I'd like to admit. That admission changed something subtle in the space between them. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. But acknowledgement. The aircraft began to push back slowly from the gate. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the cabin. The safety announcement started overhead, calm, structured, routine, but neither of them fully listened. Richard stared forward again. But his thoughts were no longer on status. Or comfort. Or control. They were somewhere else entirely. Replaying the moment. The words. The silence. The reactions. The shift. He remembered how easy it had been to reduce a person into an assumption. How quickly confidence had turned into entitlement. How natural it had felt, until it didn't. After a long pause, he spoke again. You didn't have to sit through that, he said quietly. I mean, you could have said something earlier. Keanu looked at him. His expression remained calm. I could have, he said. And I chose not to. Richard frowned slightly. Why? Keanu turned his gaze back toward the window. Because outside, the aircraft was big. Slowly. Smoothly. We don't always need to react to everything, he said. Sometimes people reveal more when they're allowed to speak freely. Richard absorbed that. Let it sit. Then nodded slowly. I think I understand that better now, he said. Keanu didn't respond immediately. But his silence wasn't withdrawal. It was acceptance of space. The plane turned toward the runway. Light stretching ahead like a path already decided. Inside the cabin, passengers settled deeper into their seats. Belts tightened. Phones were stowed. The familiar rhythm of departure returned. But something in row 2 remained altered. Not broken. Not repaired. Changed. Richard leaned back slightly. Not fully relaxed. But no longer rigid. I'm sorry, he said again after a moment. Quieter this time. Less performative. More personal. Keanu turned toward him. Looked at him for a long moment. And then nodded once. Thank you, he said. Richard waited. This time not for judgment. But for understanding. Keanu added, gently. What matters is what you do after this. Richard nodded slowly. I'll remember that, he said. The plane paused at the edge of the runway. Engines deepened. A rising hum filled the cabin. Keanu looked forward now. Calm. Still. Present. Richard did the same. But his thoughts were no longer ahead. They were behind him. And for the first time. That felt more important. Then. The plane began to move. The aircraft rolled forward with growing momentum, the vibration beneath the cabin becoming steadier, more deliberate, as if the entire moment from earlier was being carried along with it. Outside the window, runway lights stretched in clean, glowing lines, guiding the plane into motion. Inside, the cabin settled into the familiar structure of departure, flight attendants securing final checks, overhead bins locked, seatbacks upright, trays stowed. But in row 2, the emotional landscape remained far more complex than the mechanical one outside. Richard sat in silence, his hands resting on the armrests, no longer gripping them tightly, but no longer relaxed either. His posture had shifted subtly over the past few minutes, not toward comfort, but toward reflection. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from processing something difficult. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained as he had been from the beginning. Calm. Composed. Unchanged in posture, but not unchanged in presence. Because now, Richard saw him differently. Not as an obstacle. Not as a judgment. But as a person he had misread completely. The plane turned onto the runway, aligning itself for takeoff. A final safety announcement played overhead, soft and structured, guiding passengers into familiar protocol. Seatbelts were checked again. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Richard exhaled slowly. Then, without turning his head fully, he spoke. I keep thinking about what you said, he admitted. Keanu turned slightly toward him. Which part? He asked. Richard hesitated. Because now, the words carried weight they hadn't carried before. That respect shouldn't depend on knowing someone's name, he said. Keanu nodded once, quietly. Yes. Richard looked down at his hands. I didn't think about it like that before, he continued. I thought I could judge people quickly. You know? First impressions. Clothes, behavior, appearance. He paused, swallowing slightly. And I was confident in that judgment. Keanu listened without interruption. Not because he was agreeing. Not because he was disagreeing. But because he was allowing the thought to fully exist. Richard continued, voice lower now. But today, it didn't stay in my head. I said it out loud. In front of people. A faint exhale escaped him, somewhere between regret and realization. That's different, he said quietly. Keanu looked forward for a moment, watching the runway ahead. Yes, he said. It is. The simplicity of the answer made Richard glance at him again. There was no punishment in Keanu's tone. No satisfaction. Just clarity. The plane accelerated slightly. A deeper vibration filled the cabin as the engines worked harder, pulling the aircraft forward into motion. Richard felt it, but his attention wasn't on the takeoff anymore. It was inward. I think I've been wrong more often than I realized, he said after a pause. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He let the sentence settle. Then replied gently. Most people are. That wasn't an excuse. It wasn't dismissal. It was observation. And somehow, it made Richard feel less defensive. More honest. The aircraft gathered speed. The runway lights began to blur into continuous streaks outside the window. Richard looked forward, then slightly downward. I thought success meant being able to decide things quickly, he said. To know instantly what matters and what doesn't. He gave a faint, almost tired breath. But I think I confused that with something else. Keanu turned his head slightly. What did you confuse it with? He asked. Richard paused. Choosing the answer carefully now. Control, he said finally. The word stayed between them. Clear. Simple. Uncomfortable. The plane began its lift. A subtle shift in gravity pressed passengers gently into their seats. Outside, the ground began to fall away. Inside, the silence deepened again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was reflective. Keanu watched the horizon slowly tilt upward through the window. Then spoke. Control is often an illusion, he said. Richard nodded slowly. I'm starting to see that. A quiet pause followed. The aircraft climbed steadily now, leaving the runway behind. City lights below began to shrink into scattered patterns. The world outside grew smaller. More distant. Richard leaned back slightly, letting the seat support him fully for the first time since boarding. I should have handled it differently, he said again, softer. Keanu turned toward him. You realize that now, he said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded. Yes. Another pause. Then Keanu added, gently but firmly. That's where change begins. Richard looked at him. Not as a famous actor. Not as someone he had misjudged. But as someone whose calmness now felt earned. I didn't expect this conversation to go like this, Richard admitted. Keanu gave a faint, almost invisible smile. Most things don't go as expected, he said. The plane leveled slightly, continuing its climb into open sky. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the cabin had settled into a quieter rhythm now. No more tension. No more attention. Just motion. Richard stared ahead. Then spoke again, more quietly than before. I think I owe you more than just an apology, he said. Keanu looked at him calmly. What do you think you owe me? He asked. Richard hesitated. Because the answer wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't about fixing a moment. It was about understanding it. I owe you, he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. Finally. I owe you the respect I should have given from the start. Keanu nodded once. That's enough, he said. The simplicity of that response settled something inside Richard. Not completely. But enough to soften the edges. The aircraft continued its steady ascent into the morning sky. Below them, the world was now distant, quiet, almost abstract. Inside, two men sat in silence again. But this silence was no longer divided by judgment. It was shaped by reflection. Richard looked out of the window for a long moment. Then quietly said, "I think I understand something now that I didn't before." Keanu didn't look away from the window. "What's that?" he asked. Richard exhaled slowly. "That how I see people, says more about me than about them." Keanu remained still for a moment. Then nodded once. "Yes," he said softly. And for the first time since the beginning of the flight, Richard didn't feel the need to defend himself. Only to understand. The plane rose higher into the sky. And the moment that had begun with judgment slowly transformed into something else entirely. Reflection. The aircraft had fully left the ground now. Beneath the cabin, the city was no longer a solid presence. Just fading geometry of roads, lights, and early morning movement shrinking into abstraction. The sky outside shifted from soft gray to a clearer, higher blue, as if the world itself was being washed into distance. Inside first class, the atmosphere had changed again. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But in the quiet way tension dissolves when it is no longer fed. Richard sat with his head slightly angled toward the window, but his attention was no longer outside. It was inward. Heavy, steady, unavoidable. The earlier arrogance that had filled his posture felt like something he had outgrown in a matter of minutes, even though it still lingered in memory like an echo. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained still. Calm as ever. Not distant, not cold, just present in a way that did not demand attention but naturally held it anyway. Richard finally broke the silence again, though his voice was lower now, stripped of the earlier sharpness. "I keep replaying it," he admitted. Keanu turned slightly toward him. "The beginning?" he asked. Richard gave a faint, almost embarrassed nod. "The beginning?" he asked. Richard gave a faint, almost embarrassed nod. "Everything," he said. "The way I spoke. The way I assumed things. It sounded normal to me at the time." He paused, swallowing slightly. "That's what worries me." Keanu listened without interruption. Not because he was encouraging guilt, but because he understood the importance of letting someone finish the thought honestly. Richard continued, slower now. "I didn't feel like I was being cruel," he said. "I felt like I was justified. Like I had the right to decide what belonged where." He exhaled through his nose. "And that felt normal." A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just reflective. Keanu looked out the window again. The clouds were thicker now, soft and layered, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Then he spoke. "That's how assumptions usually feel," he said quietly. Richard turned slightly toward him. "Normal?" he asked. Keanu nodded. "Yes." Richard frowned faintly, absorbing that. "That's unsettling," he said. Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It should be," he replied. The honesty of it didn't sting, but it grounded the conversation. Richard leaned back more fully into his seat now, no longer holding tension in his shoulders. "I've had conversations like that before," he said. "Not exactly like this, but similar. Where I thought I understood a situation immediately." He paused. "And I was wrong." Keanu didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hold the statement. Then asked gently, "What made today different?" Richard looked at him for a moment, thinking. Not quickly this time. Not defensively. Finally, he answered. "Because I said it out loud," he said. "And people heard it." He gave a small, uneasy breath. "And I saw what it looked like from the outside." Keanu nodded slowly. "That part matters," he said. Richard glanced forward again, then down at his hands. I didn't like what I saw, he admitted. The plane continued its steady climb. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, but the cabin was now calm. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, ensuring everything was secure, everything in order. But in row 2, order had already been redefined. Richard shifted slightly. Then spoke again. You didn't react the way I expected you to, he said. Keanu turned toward him. How did you expect me to react? He asked. Richard hesitated. Then gave a faint, honest smile, not amused, but self-aware. Anger, he said. Or embarrassment. Maybe even defensiveness. He looked at Keanu more directly now. Something that would make me feel justified in my reaction. Keanu considered that for a moment. Then replied simply. And would that have helped? Richard shook his head almost immediately. No, he said. Not at all. Another pause. The aircraft leveled slightly as it continued forward into open sky. Richard leaned his head back against the seat. I think I understand something now, he said quietly. Keanu glanced at him. What's that? He asked. Richard exhaled slowly. That being wrong isn't the worst part, he said. It's how confident I was while being wrong. Keanu nodded once. Yes, he said. No elaboration. No emphasis. Just agreement with reality. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing that fully. I've built a lot of my life on being decisive, he said. On being certain. He opened his eyes again. But certainty isn't the same as truth. Keanu looked at him for a moment longer than before. No, he said softly. It isn't. The cabin around them remained steady, almost soothing now. The earlier tension felt like something that belonged to another version of the flight, another version of themselves. Richard turned toward Keanu again. I should have just asked you a question instead of making an assumption, he said. Keanu tilted his head slightly. You did ask questions, he said. Richard gave a faint, self-aware smile. Not the right ones, he replied. Keanu nodded. That's often the difference, he said. The words weren't corrective. They were clarifying. And that made them easier to hear. Richard looked out the window again. The sky had fully opened now, bright, wide, uninterrupted. I think I've been confusing confidence with understanding, he said quietly. Keanu watched the horizon. They're not the same thing, he said. Richard nodded. I see that now. A long pause followed. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was settling. Like something finally finding its place. Richard shifted slightly in his seat again, but this time it wasn't discomfort. It was reflection finding a resting point. I'm still thinking about how quickly I judged you, he said. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He waited. Richard continued. And how unnecessary it was, he added. You hadn't done anything. You were just sitting there. He shook his head slightly. That says more about me than anything else. Keanu finally looked at him. His expression was calm. Not approving. Not disapproving. Just present. Yes, he said softly. Richard nodded. I don't want to be that person, he said quietly. Keanu held his gaze for a moment. Then replied. Then don't be. It was simple. But not easy. And Richard understood that. The plane continued forward through the sky, smooth and steady. Below them, the world was now distant enough to feel almost symbolic. And inside row 2, something had shifted permanently, not through spectacle, not through confrontation, but through realization. Richard looked forward again. And this time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. Not anymore. Just to understand. The aircraft had settled into its cruising rhythm now, the kind of steady, almost hypnotic motion that makes time feel slightly suspended above the earth. The engines produced a constant, distant hum, no longer something noticeable, but something felt more than heard, like the background heartbeat of the sky. Inside the cabin, the lighting softened into a calmer tone. First-class passengers adjusted their seats, some leaning back into rest, others opening trays or quietly sipping drinks. The earlier tension that had once pulled attention toward row 2 was now fading into the natural flow of the flight. But for Richard, nothing had fully faded. Because even though the scene had ended, the understanding had not. He sat with his hands loosely resting on the armrests, no longer tense, but no longer comfortable either. It wasn't physical discomfort now. It was awareness. The kind that stays after a moment changes how you see yourself. Keanu Reeves remained beside him, looking out of the window, his posture unchanged from the beginning of the flight. Calm. Grounded. Still. Not performing calmness. Simply existing in it. Richard finally broke the silence again, his voice quieter than before. "I used to think confidence meant certainty," he said. Keanu turned slightly toward him. He didn't respond immediately. He was listening. Richard continued, choosing his words carefully now, as if each one carried more weight than the last. "I thought if I spoke quickly, decided quickly, judged quickly, it meant I understood things," he said. "People. Situations. Everything." He gave a faint, almost tired exhale. "But today I realized something." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "What's that?" he asked. Richard looked forward, toward the front of the cabin, where passengers were now fully settled and quiet. "That I wasn't understanding anything," he said. "I was just reacting." A brief silence followed. Not empty. Reflective. Keanu nodded once. "That happens often," he said quietly. Richard turned slightly toward him again. "It does?" he asked. Keanu kept his gaze steady. "Yes," he said. "People often react faster than they observe." Richard let that sink in. It wasn't judgment. It was observation. And somehow, that made it easier to accept. He leaned back slightly in his seat. "I didn't observe anything about you," he admitted. "Not really. I just filled in the blanks myself." Keanu didn't respond right away. He let the honesty sit between them. Then he said softly, "That's what assumptions do." Richard nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I see that now." Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, no longer divided by clouds or horizon lines. Just open space. Clean and vast. Richard watched it for a moment, then spoke again. "I think I've spent a lot of my life avoiding uncertainty," he said. "I like things defined. Clear. Immediate." He paused. "But people aren't like that." Keanu glanced at him briefly. "No," he said. "They're not." The simplicity of the agreement made Richard exhale, almost like something inside him was finally relaxing. "I made you into something you weren't," he said quietly. "In my head." Keanu turned slightly toward him now. "What did you make me into?" he asked, not accusatory, just curious. Richard hesitated. Then answered honestly. "Someone who didn't belong," he said. "Based on nothing." Keanu looked at him for a moment longer than before. Then nodded once. "That's usually how exclusion begins," he said. Richard frowned slightly, but not defensively. More thoughtfully. "I didn't think of it as exclusion," he said. "I thought it was preference." Keanu nodded again. "Most people do," he said. Richard gave a faint, almost uncomfortable smile. That sounds worse when you say it like that, he admitted. Keanu's expression remained calm. It's not meant to sound better or worse, he said. Just accurate. Richard looked down at his hands again. Accurate. That word stayed with him. Because everything that had happened earlier had been many things, embarrassing, uncomfortable, public, but now, stripped down, it felt accurate in a way he couldn't avoid anymore. He leaned his head back slightly. I think I confused comfort with correctness, he said quietly. Keanu looked out the window again. That happens too, he replied. Another silence followed. But this one was different. Less tense. More open. The aircraft maintained its steady course through the sky, the clouds drifting slowly past like soft layers of thought. Richard shifted slightly in his seat. Then spoke again, softer this time. I didn't expect you to stay so calm through all of that, he said. Keanu turned his head slightly. What would reacting have changed, he asked. Richard paused. Then gave a small, honest shrug. Nothing, he admitted. Keanu nodded. Then there's no need for it, he said. The simplicity of that answer settled into Richard's thoughts more deeply than anything else so far. No need for it. Not weakness. Not avoidance. Just choice. Richard exhaled slowly. I think I understand something I didn't before, he said. Keanu looked at him. What's that? He asked. Richard stared forward. That not every situation needs to be won, he said quietly. Some need to be understood. Keanu nodded once. Yes, he said. The word wasn't praise. It wasn't correction. It was confirmation. Richard looked out the window again, this time not searching for distraction, but letting his thoughts settle. I wish I could take back how I spoke earlier, he said. Keanu remained calm. You can't take it back, he said. But you can change what it means going forward. Richard turned toward him slightly. And how do I do that? He asked. Keanu paused for a moment. Then answered simply. By noticing before deciding. Richard repeated it quietly in his mind. Noticing before deciding. He nodded. I can try that, he said. Keanu gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. That's all anyone can do, he replied. The cabin remained quiet now. Not because of tension. But because the moment had settled into something stable. Outside, the sky continued to open. Inside, two men sat in the same row they had begun in, but no longer in the same understanding. Richard leaned back fully now, no longer resisting the seat beneath him. Not because he had forgotten what happened. But because he had finally begun to understand it. And for the first time since boarding. He wasn't trying to correct the moment. Only learn from it. The aircraft continued its smooth journey through the sky, now far above the ground where everything that had happened earlier felt both distant and strangely close at the same time. The cabin had settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that comes after emotional turbulence, not loud anymore, but not fully calm either. It was reflective. Thoughtful. Heavy in a subtle way. Richard sat in his seat with a posture that had changed completely from the beginning of the flight. Earlier, he had occupied space with certainty, as if confidence came from control. Now he occupied it differently, less rigid, more aware. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if even the smallest gesture carried meaning he hadn't noticed before. Keanu Reeves remained beside him, still looking out of the window. His presence had not shifted with the situation. That was what continued to unsettle Richard in a quiet way. Because everything had changed around them, except him. No reaction had bent him. No humiliation had broken his calm. No recognition had altered his composure. He had simply remained himself. Richard finally spoke again, breaking the long silence. "I keep thinking about something," he said quietly. Keanu turned slightly toward him, signaling that he was listening. Richard continued, choosing his words more slowly now, as if he was no longer trying to sound right, only honest. "When I first looked at you," he said, "I didn't see a person. I saw a problem." A brief silence followed. Keanu didn't interrupt. Richard exhaled through his nose, almost like he was frustrated with himself. "That's the part one can't ignore," he added. "I didn't even wait to understand. I just labeled you." Keanu looked at him for a moment. Then spoke gently. "Most people label quickly," he said. Richard nodded. "I know," he replied. "But hearing it now, it sounds worse than it did in my head." Keanu turned back toward the window briefly. "That's usually how reflection works," he said. Richard let that settle. The hum of the engines filled the space between them for a moment. Not uncomfortable anymore, but grounding. Like the plane itself was steady enough to hold difficult thoughts without breaking them. Richard leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I've been thinking about why I did it," he said. "Why I reacted that way." Keanu didn't look at him, but his attention was present. Richard continued. "It wasn't about you," he admitted. "Not really." He paused. "That's what scares me." Keanu finally turned his head slightly. "What do you think it was about?" he asked. Richard stared at the seat in front of him for a moment before answering. "Control," he said. "Or the illusion of it." Keanu nodded once, slowly. Richard continued, gaining clarity as he spoke. "I walked into that cabin expecting things to be arranged in a certain way," he said. "People, behavior, everything fitting a picture I already had in my mind." He shook his head slightly. "And when you didn't fit that picture, I didn't adjust my thinking. I tried to adjust you instead." Keanu listened quietly. That was the difference, Richard realized. Keanu didn't interrupt. Didn't correct. Didn't rush the thought. He let it exist fully before responding. Richard exhaled again. "That's a habit I didn't realize I had," he said. "Fitting people into categories instead of understanding them as they are." Keanu looked out the window again, then spoke. "Categories help people feel safe," he said. "But they often remove detail." Richard nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "And detail is where truth is." Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he said. Richard leaned back slightly in his seat again, this time not stiffly, but thoughtfully. "I think I've been mistaking speed for intelligence," he said. "The faster I judged something, the more confident I felt. Like certainty was proof I was right." He gave a faint, self-aware breath. "But today proved the opposite." Keanu turned slightly toward him. "How so?" he asked. Richard looked at him directly now. "Because I was certain," he said. "And I was wrong." A silence followed that statement. "Not heavy. Clear." Keanu nodded once. "That's an important realization," he said. Richard gave a small, almost ironic smile. "It doesn't feel important," he admitted. "It feels uncomfortable." Keanu's tone remained calm. "Most important realizations do," he said. Richard looked away again, toward the window. Outside, clouds stretched like slow-moving landscapes beneath them. Endless. Soft. Unjudging. "I think I used status as a shortcut," he said after a moment. "If someone didn't match what I expected, I assumed they were less." Keanu listened without changing expression. Richard continued, voice quieter now. "And I didn't even question it." A pause. That's the part one don't like about myself right now. Keanu turned his head slightly. The awareness is the beginning of change, he said. Richard looked at him. You really believe that? He asked. Keanu didn't hesitate. Yes, he said simply. That simplicity carried weight. No reassurance. No comfort designed to soften truth. Just certainty based on experience, not emotion. Richard nodded slowly. I don't want to stay like I was earlier, he said. Keanu watched him for a moment. Then don't, he replied. The answer was so direct that it almost made Richard smile. I wish it were that simple, Richard said. Keanu tilted his head slightly. It is, he said. And it isn't. Richard let out a quiet breath, almost amused. That's not very helpful, he said. Keanu's expression softened slightly. It's not meant to be, he said. It's meant to be true. That line stayed in the air longer than the others. Richard looked forward again, thinking. True. Not convenient. Not comforting. Just true. He ran a hand slowly along the armrest. I think I've spent too much time trying to appear correct instead of being honest, he said. Keanu looked out the window again. Many people do, he said. Richard nodded. I can see that now, he admitted. The cabin remained steady around them. A flight attendant passed quietly through the aisle, checking overhead bins, offering soft acknowledgments to passengers. Life inside the plane continued normally, as if the emotional weight in row 2 existed in a parallel space that only a few had noticed. But for Richard, that space was everything right now. Because it wasn't about embarrassment anymore. It was about understanding. And understanding, he was learning, took longer than any reaction ever had. He turned slightly toward Keanu again. I don't expect anything from you after this, he said. Keanu looked at him. I know, he replied. Richard nodded. And I don't want to pretend it didn't happen, he added. Keanu studied him briefly. That's also part of learning, he said. Richard exhaled slowly. I think this flight is going to feel shorter than I expected, he said quietly. Keanu gave a small, calm nod. Time feels different when you reflect, he said. Richard leaned back again, this time fully, letting his head rest against the seat. For the first time since boarding, he wasn't trying to fix how he was seen. He was only trying to understand how he had seen. And as the aircraft continued its quiet path through the sky, that shift, small but irreversible, became the only thing that mattered. The aircraft had entered a smoother stretch of flight now, where the engines no longer felt like a force of movement, but like a constant, distant presence, steady, reliable, almost calming. The sky outside had shifted into a softer shade of blue, with thin layers of clouds drifting beneath them like slow-moving thoughts. Inside the cabin, most passengers had settled into their own quiet worlds. Some were reading, some resting, some simply staring out of the windows, letting the flight pass in silence. The earlier tension that had once drawn attention toward row 2 was now gone from the surface, but not from memory. Because some moments don't disappear. They just change shape. Richard sat with his head slightly tilted back, eyes open but unfocused, as if his mind was replaying something he couldn't turn off. There was no more arrogance in his posture, no more sharp certainty in his expression. What remained now was reflection, uneven, uncomfortable, but real. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained as he had been throughout the entire journey, calm, grounded, quietly observant. He wasn't distant, but he wasn't reaching either. It was a kind of presence that didn't demand anything from the space around it. Richard finally spoke again, his voice softer than before. I've been trying to understand something, he said. Keanu turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without interrupting. Richard continued, searching for clarity in his own thoughts. Why it hit me so hard after I found out who you were, he admitted. Why my reaction changed, even though what I did was already wrong before I knew anything about you. Keanu listened quietly. Richard exhaled slowly. That's what confuses me, he said. Because the behavior didn't change. Only my awareness did. He paused, then added more honestly. And yet I reacted differently. Keanu looked at him for a moment. That's because perception influences judgment, he said calmly. Richard nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I think I'm starting to see that. He rubbed his fingers together slightly, as if grounding himself in the moment. I didn't correct myself when I thought you were unknown, he said. But the moment I knew your name, I felt embarrassed. Keanu watched him without judgment. Richard continued. And that's the part one don't like, he admitted. That I needed recognition to feel regret. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Keanu turned toward the window for a moment before speaking. Recognition doesn't create morality, he said. It only exposes what was already there. Richard absorbed that quietly. It wasn't comforting. But it was precise. I didn't think of it like that, he said. Keanu nodded slightly. Most people don't, he replied. Richard leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on his knees again. I keep replaying how confident I felt in that moment, he said. How certain I was that I was right about you. He gave a faint, self-aware breath. And how wrong that certainty was. Keanu looked at him. Certainty without understanding is fragile, he said. Richard nodded slowly. That explains a lot, he said quietly. The cabin around them remained steady, the hum of the engines now almost soothing instead of mechanical. A flight attendant passed through the aisle, gently checking on passengers, her presence brief and unobtrusive. Life continued in soft motion around them, but the conversation in row 2 felt like it existed slightly outside of it, slower, deeper, more internal. Richard shifted again in his seat, but this time not from discomfort. From thought. I think I spent most of my life assuming respect is something people earn outwardly, he said. Appearance, status, behavior, things I can see immediately. He paused. But I didn't think about what happens when I don't see enough. Keanu turned his head slightly. And what happens? He asked. Richard hesitated, then answered honestly. I fill in the gaps with assumptions, he said. And I usually assume I'm right. Keanu nodded once. That's a common pattern, he said. Richard let out a faint breath, almost a half-laugh, but without humor. It's uncomfortable hearing how common it is, he admitted. It makes it harder to excuse. Keanu's expression remained steady. Clarity is rarely comfortable, he said. Richard looked at him for a moment. You don't seem uncomfortable at all, he said quietly. Keanu glanced back toward the window. I've had time to understand how people see before I react to how they see me, he said. That sentence landed quietly between them. Richard absorbed it. You mean you expect it? He asked. Keanu shook his head slightly. No, he said. I don't expect it. I just don't depend on approval to define my place. Richard nodded slowly, as if that distinction mattered more than he initially realized. That's difficult for me, he admitted. Keanu looked at him. It is for most people, he said. Richard leaned back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. I think I've been outsourcing my confidence, he said. Keanu turned slightly toward him. How so? He asked. Richard considered the question carefully. By relying on how others perceive situations to validate my reactions, he said. If I feel supported by status or agreement, I feel justified. If not, I get uncomfortable. He paused. And today I didn't have that support. Keanu nodded once. So you were forced to see your reaction without it, he said. Richard exhaled. Exactly, he said. A quiet pause followed. Not empty. Clear. Richard looked toward Keanu again. I want to be better than that version of myself, he said. Keanu studied him for a moment. Then don't return to automatic thinking, he said. Richard nodded. That's going to take effort, he admitted. Keanu gave a slight nod. It always does, he said. Outside, the sky had shifted again. The light was warmer now, as if the sun had moved closer to their path. Clouds below looked softer, less like barriers and more like layers of distance. Richard watched them for a moment. Then spoke quietly. You stayed calm through all of it, he said. Even when you were being disrespected. Keanu didn't look away from the window. Calm doesn't mean absence of feeling, he said. It means choosing how to respond to it. Richard nodded slowly. That's what I didn't understand earlier, he admitted. Keanu turned slightly toward him. And now? He asked. Richard thought for a moment. Now I think reaction is easy, he said. Understanding takes discipline. Keanu gave a small, almost approving nod. Yes, he said. The conversation eased into silence again, but it was no longer a silence of distance. It was shared reflection now, two different minds moving through the same event at different speeds. Richard leaned back fully in his seat again. I don't think I'll forget this flight, he said quietly. Keanu looked at him briefly. Most people don't forget moments that change perspective, he said. Richard nodded. I think this one did, he admitted. Outside, the plane continued forward, steady and unshaken. Inside, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But permanently. And as the cabin remained calm, Richard sat quietly beside the man he had once tried to dismiss, realizing now that the most important part of the journey had never been the destination. It had been the change in how he saw the person sitting right next to him. The descent had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, the way large things often end, not with suddenness, but with a gradual shift in feeling. The cabin announcement came softly through the speakers, instructing passengers to return their seats to an upright position and prepare for landing. The tone was routine, familiar, almost comforting. But for Richard, it didn't feel routine anymore. It felt final in a different way. Not the end of the flight. The end of something inside him that had started cracking open earlier and had slowly continued throughout the journey. Outside the window, the world below was becoming clearer, roads, buildings, patterns of movement returning into view as the aircraft lowered through layers of sky. The bright openness of cruising altitude was giving way to structure again. Direction. Detail. Reality. Inside the cabin, passengers adjusted quietly. Seatbelts clicked. Devices were tucked away. Conversations lowered into whispers or stopped. Entirely. And still, row 2 remained unusually calm. Keanu Reeves sat by the window, his posture unchanged, as if the descent was just another part of the journey rather than its conclusion. There was no urgency in him, no anticipation in his expression. Only presence. Fully here, fully aware, without needing the moment to be anything more than what it was. Richard, beside him, stared forward for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point during the flight. I keep thinking about how easily I could have gone through life without realizing any of this, he said. Keanu turned his head slightly, listening. Richard continued. I could have walked off this plane, gone back to my life, and never questioned the way I saw people. He paused. And I would have thought that was normal. Keanu remained silent for a moment, letting the words settle. Then he spoke gently. Most people do, he said. Richard nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. That's what scares me a little, he admitted. How normal it felt. Keanu looked at him briefly. Normal doesn't always mean right, he said. Richard let out a slow breath through his nose, almost like he was releasing something he had been holding for hours. I understand that now, he said. A quiet pause followed. The aircraft tilted slightly as it continued its descent, sunlight now sharper through the windows, more defined, casting clearer lines across the cabin seats. Richard turned his head toward Keanu. I owe you more than I said earlier, he admitted. Keanu met his gaze calmly. You already said what mattered, he replied. Richard shook his head slightly. No, he said. I think I said the beginning of it. Not the full thing. He hesitated, choosing honesty over comfort. I didn't just treat you badly, he said. I revealed something about how I treat people when I think no one important is watching. Keanu listened without interruption. Richard continued. And that's not something I want to ignore anymore. Keanu nodded once. That's good, he said simply. The simplicity of that response made Richard exhale again, this time with a faint sense of grounding. Outside, the runway lights were becoming visible in the distance. The aircraft aligned itself, steady and precise, preparing for touchdown. Inside, something quieter was aligning too. Richard leaned slightly forward, hands resting loosely together. I used to think being wrong meant losing something, he said. Respect. Position. Control. He paused. But I think I understand now, being wrong just means there's something left to learn. Keanu looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. If you're willing to see it that way. Richard nodded. I am, he said quietly. The plane lowered further. The ground was close now, details sharper, movement below more visible. Richard glanced out the window briefly, then back at Keanu. I'm sorry for how I treated you, he said again, but this time it wasn't rushed or defensive. It wasn't trying to fix the moment. It was acknowledging it. Fully. Keanu held his gaze for a second longer than before. Then nodded once. I hear you, he said. That was it. No added weight. No performance of forgiveness. No dramatic closure. Just recognition. And somehow, that was enough. The wheels touched down with a smooth, controlled impact, followed by the familiar hum of reverse thrust. The cabin gently shifted forward with motion, then steadied again as the aircraft slowed. Around them, passengers began to relax. Some exhaled. Some reached for bags. Some smiled in anticipation of arrival. But row 2 remained still for a few more seconds longer than the rest. Richard sat quietly, watching the world outside grow more solid with each passing moment. I think this will stay with me longer than I expect, he said softly. Keanu looked out the window. It usually does, he replied. Richard gave a faint nod. I don't think I'll forget what it felt like, to be wrong in front of people, he admitted. Keanu turned slightly toward him. That feeling isn't the important part, he said. What you do with it is. Richard considered that. Then nodded slowly. I don't want to repeat it, he said. Keanu's expression remained steady. Then don't, he said again, simple, grounded, real. The aircraft rolled toward the gate now, slowing into its final position. The terminal building came into view, steady and familiar, as if pulling them back into the normal world after something internal had shifted. The seatbelt sign remained on for a moment longer. Silence held the cabin together. Richard looked at Keanu one final time before landing fully settled. I didn't expect to learn something like this today, he said quietly. Keanu gave a small, calm nod. Life rarely asks for expectation, he replied. It just gives moments. The plane came to a gentle stop. A soft chime sounded through the cabin. And just like that, the journey was technically over. But neither man moved immediately. Because something more meaningful than arrival had already taken place. Richard finally unbuckled his seatbelt, slower than everyone else, as if respecting the weight of what had just happened. He didn't rush to stand. Didn't rush to leave. He simply remained for a moment in the stillness. Then he turned slightly toward Keanu one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. Keanu looked at him. Not with pride. Not with distance. Just with calm understanding. "You're welcome," he replied. Richard nodded once. Then slowly stood up, stepping into the aisle, no longer carrying the same energy he had entered with. As passengers began to move toward the exits, the cabin filled with motion again, but the kind of motion that follows reflection, not conflict. Keanu remained seated for a moment longer, looking out at the terminal lights beyond the window. The world outside had not changed. But something inside the space they shared had. And as he finally prepared to stand and leave, the moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like something quieter. A reminder. That dignity doesn't always speak loudly. But it always stays. And sometimes, the most important journeys don't take you somewhere new. They change the way you see where you already are.